All right, let's get right into today's explainer. We are unpacking one of the most terrifying, absolutely high-tension aviation crises we've seen in modern history. It's one of those situations that started as a frightening local incident, but man, it just rapidly mutated into this massive, multinational challenge for national security and high-stakes diplomacy. I'm talking, of course, about the hijacking of Indian Airlines Flight IC-814, an ordeal most of us know as the Kandahar Hijack Case.
So, it really begs the question, what actually happens when an entire nation is held hostage? Because make no mistake here, this wasn't just your run-of-the-mill hijacking. As we dig into the details today, you're going to see that this was a profound psychological war. It was this agonizing, week-long crisis that kept a whole country helplessly glued to their television screens, literally paralyzed by fear for the innocent folks trapped up in the sky, all while the government was just scrambling in the dark.
Let's start with Act 1. The nightmare begins.
Picture this. It's December 24th, 1999, Christmas Eve. There's this really festive holiday mood in the air, right? Indian Airlines Flight IC-814 takes off from Kathmandu, Nepal, heading back toward New Delhi. On board, you've got over 170 passengers and crew members, and everything is completely normal. These are everyday people traveling for business, returning from honeymoon trips, or just flying home to see their families for the holidays. The vibe is totally relaxed, and absolutely nobody had any idea that within just a few minutes, this exact flight would become the epicenter of a historical nightmare.
But just shortly into the flight, that comfortable normalcy was violently shattered. Just 5 individuals on board, who had blended in perfectly with all the other holiday travelers, suddenly sprang into action. Armed with guns, knives, and even grenades, they rapidly moved through the aisles. Before anyone could even truly process what was happening, these 5 hijackers completely captured the aircraft. They seized absolute control and instantly flipped the balance of power.
The crew and the passengers were thrown into pure shock as the hijackers breached the cockpit and physically forced the pilots to divert the plane. And this really exposes a terrifying reality of pre-9/11 aviation vulnerability. Cockpit doors simply weren't the impenetrable fortresses that they are today. Just think about the sheer claustrophobia and terror of that exact moment. You're flying home for the holidays, looking forward to seeing your family, and in the blink of an eye, your life is completely in the hands of armed militants who are dictating your every move thousands of feet in the air.
Which brings us to Act 2, the desperate flight path.
The agonizing journey that followed wasn't just a straight line from point A to point B. It was a frantic, chaotic bouncing across borders that seriously tested the limits of the aircraft's fuel and, honestly, the passengers' endurance. First, the plane touched down in Amritsar, India, where Indian authorities narrowly missed this absolutely crucial window to stop the aircraft from taking off again. Running dangerously low on fuel, the pilots were then forced to fly to Lahore, Pakistan, literally crash landing in the dark before they were finally allowed to refuel. Then, it was on to a military base in Dubai. The hijackers did release a few passengers there, but tragically, they fatally stabbed a young man named Rupin Katyal. With every single frantic stop, these hijackers were desperately slipping further and further away from Indian jurisdiction until they finally touched down in Kandahar, Afghanistan.
Now, by landing in Kandahar, the dynamics of this whole crisis completely shifted. At the time, Kandahar was the stronghold of the Taliban. This is a massive, crucial detail, because India did not officially recognize the Taliban government. There were no Indian embassies there, no established diplomatic channels, zero trust. The plane was now sitting deep in foreign, hostile territory, completely surrounded by heavily armed Taliban fighters. This meant India had absolutely no direct control over the situation on the ground. A military rescue operation by Indian commandos? Virtually impossible. The diplomatic isolation was absolute.
Meanwhile, inside that aircraft, conditions were rapidly deteriorating into a living hell. The plane was just sitting on the tarmac in the middle of the freezing Afghan winter desert. The passengers were trapped in this highly tense, claustrophobic environment for days. The plane's auxiliary power was frequently cut, leaving everyone in freezing darkness. Food and water were incredibly scarce. The toilets completely overflowed, filling the cabin with this suffocating stench. And through it all, the hostages faced extreme, paralyzing fear and constant, aggressive threats from the hijackers who controlled every single movement. And back home in India, the families of those 170 people were glued to non-stop news coverage in total panic mode, watching their loved ones suffer on screen while being completely powerless to do a single thing about it.
Let's move on to Act 3, the impossible political demand. When you hear the word hijacking, it's super easy to assume the motive is some massive cash ransom. But this wasn't about money at all. The demand was strictly political and incredibly high stakes. The hijackers aggressively pushed to demand to free 3 highly dangerous, high-ranking militants who are currently imprisoned in Indian jails, including Maulana Masood Azhar. This instantly transformed a terrifying hostage situation into a grueling, days-long standoff where the fate of over 170 innocent people was tied directly to the release of individuals known to be a severe threat to national security.
The Indian government was trapped in an absolute, impossible dilemma. I mean, they had 0 good options. On one hand, you reject the demand, and the passengers' lives remain at immediate, critical risk. The hijackers had already proven they were more than willing to kill. On the other hand, you accept the demand, release these hardened terrorists back into the world, and you give a massive boost to future terrorism. And remember, all of these incredibly sensitive life-or-death negotiations had to happen through incredibly limited, strained diplomatic channels right in the middle of hostile Taliban territory.
Days upon days just dragged on. The rest of the world was actually getting ready to celebrate New Year's Eve and ring in the new millennium, the year 2000, while these families were stuck in a waking nightmare. The situation aboard that freezing plane was failing fast. After agonizing negotiations and with suffocating pressure mounting over the passengers' rapidly deteriorating health, the government made their incredibly difficult choice. The final deal was struck in the dark. The Indian government literally escorted the 3 imprisoned terrorists to Kandahar and handed them over. In exchange, the hijackers finally released the exhausted, completely traumatized hostages.
The aftermath of this exchange? Well, it's still hotly debated to this day. When that relief plane finally landed back in India, families felt an overwhelming, indescribable joy. Lives were saved. The nightmare for those individuals was over, and that is undeniably crucial. But zooming out, the decision remained highly controversial and carried a heavy, devastating cost. Security experts correctly warned that this exchange set a very dangerous precedent. The militants released that day, particularly Maulana Masood Azhar, went on to found deadly terror organizations and orchestrate massive future attacks. Saving the lives on that plane directly fueled some pretty horrifying, unseen costs in the years that followed.
So what is the legacy here? Let's look at the impact on national security. The Kandahar crisis served as a massive, painful wake-up call that completely redefined aviation safety in India, long before the global shifts that happened after 9/11. It triggered a total, sweeping overhaul of the nation's security infrastructure. Airport security across the country was significantly upgraded with far stricter baggage and passenger screenings. The government enforced much stronger, uncompromising hijacking protocols, which actually included the quiet deployment of armed sky marshals on commercial flights to stop future hijackers right in their tracks. Cockpit doors were reinforced. Intelligence agencies vastly increased their monitoring efforts, fully realizing that the threat of terrorism was truly on a global, coordinated scale, and the old defenses, they simply weren't going to cut it anymore.
Terrorism isn't just a war of guns, it is a psychological war. This entire ordeal really highlights a grim, heavy reality that leaders face behind closed doors during a crisis. National security decisions are rarely simple, black and white choices. There is often no clear right or wrong. Sometimes governments are only left with damage control, trying desperately to save the lives directly in front of them while quietly calculating the horrifying, unseen costs of tomorrow.
As we wrap up this terrifying true story, I want to leave you with this haunting thought to ponder. Agar IC-814 could decision different hota, to history ke outcome kya hota? What if the decision was different? What if the government had just refused to negotiate and held their ground? Think about the incredible, crushing weight of those decisions on the people who actually have to make them. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world today.